When I observed the ideological battles of the Cold War, I saw something that extended far beyond the geopolitical struggle between East and West. I witnessed the birth of a new form of political conflict, one that would eventually migrate from the realm of international relations into the very heart of domestic societies. Today's culture wars in America are not some novel phenomenon, but rather the continuation of patterns I first identified in my analysis of how ideological thinking transforms political discourse into existential warfare. The Cold War taught us that when politics becomes tautolized, when every issue is viewed through the lens of ultimate truth versus ultimate error, democratic debate gives way to something more dangerous, the politics of absolute conviction. What we're witnessing in contemporary American political life, the breakdown of shared civic space, the transformation of policy disagreements into moral crusades, the inability to distinguish between political opponents and existential enemies, these are the domestic manifestations of the same ideological dynamics that once divided the world into hostile camps. Understanding this connection is crucial because it reveals that our current polarization is not merely the result of social media or partisan manipulation, but the predictable outcome of abandoning the intellectual virtues that make democratic coexistence possible. Chapter 1: The Ideological Mind at War. During my decades observing the Cold War, I became fascinated by a peculiar transformation in how intellectuals and politicians approached political questions. The traditional art of politics, which involved negotiation, compromise, and the recognition that reasonable people could disagree, was gradually replaced by something I called ideological thinking. This wasn't merely having strong beliefs or clear principles. It was the transformation of political positions into sacred truths that brooked no contradiction. The communist intellectuals I knew in Paris after the war exemplified this perfectly. They couldn't simply argue that socialism offered better economic outcomes or greater social justice. Instead, they had to insist that history itself was on their side, that their opponents weren't just wrong but historically doomed, and that any compromise with capitalist democracy represented a betrayal of ultimate truth. This kind of thinking made normal political conversation impossible because it transformed every policy debate into a cosmic battle between good and evil. What struck me then, and what I see clearly now in American politics, is how ideological thinking operates through a specific set of mental habits. First, it reduces complex social realities to simple moral categories. Second, it treats political opponents not as fellow citizens with different views, but as obstacles to the realization of truth. Third, it interprets any setback or criticism as evidence of the opponent's moral corruption rather than legitimate disagreement. During the Cold War, this meant that Western communists couldn't acknowledge Soviet failures without questioning their entire worldview. They had to explain away the gulags, the famines, the oppression, because admitting these realities would threaten their fundamental identity as bearers of historical truth. Similarly, some anti-communists fell into the mirror image of this trap, seeing any criticism of American foreign policy or any acknowledgement of legitimate social problems as evidence of communist infiltration. The parallel to today's culture wars is striking. Progressive activists often cannot acknowledge that their opponents might have legitimate concerns about, say, rapid social change or the practical challenges of implementing ambitious social programs. Conservative activists cannot admit that their opponents might genuinely care about reducing inequality or protecting vulnerable groups. Instead, each side must interpret the other's positions as evidence of moral bankruptcy or hidden malicious intent. This ideological mindset creates what I called the opium of the intellectuals, the intoxicating belief that one's political views are not merely opinions to be debated, but truths to be imposed. Once this transformation occurs, democratic politics becomes impossible because democracy requires the assumption that one's opponents are fellow citizens deserving of respect, not enemies to be defeated at all costs. Chapter 2: The Cold War's Domestic Logic. The genius of my analysis of the Cold War was recognizing that ideological conflict doesn't remain confined to its original arena. The mental habits that intellectuals developed for thinking about international communism inevitably shaped how they approached domestic questions. If the world was divided between forces of progress and reaction, between those who understood history's direction and those who blindly resisted it, then this same logic would eventually be applied to every aspect of social life. I saw this happening in France throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Intellectuals who had organized their entire worldview around the struggle against fascism and imperialism found it impossible to approach questions of education, culture, or social policy without importing the same apocalyptic framework. Every university reform became a battle between enlightenment and obscurantism. Every cultural change was either a step toward human liberation or a retreat into barbarism. The American case is even more instructive because the Cold War lasted longer and penetrated more deeply into American institutional life. For decades, Americans learned to think about political questions in terms of existential threats and ultimate loyalties. The House Un-American Activities Committee wasn't content to investigate actual espionage. It had to determine whether particular ideas and associations were fundamentally American or un-American. McCarthyism represented the domestic application of Cold War logic, the assumption that political disagreement was really a form of civilizational warfare. But this logic didn't disappear with the end of the Cold War. Instead, it migrated into new domains. Today's debates about education, immigration, gender roles, racial justice, and cultural symbols all bear the unmistakable marks of Cold War thinking. Disagreements about curriculum become battles for the soul of civilization. Disputes about immigration policy become tests of whether one truly believes in American values. Arguments about social change become evidence of whether one stands with progress or reaction. Consider how contemporary Americans discuss education. Conservatives don't simply argue that certain pedagogical approaches are ineffective or that particular curricula are poorly designed. They must insist that progressive education represents an assault on Western civilization itself. Progressives don't simply contend that traditional approaches perpetuate inequality or that curricula should be more inclusive. They must argue that resistance to their reforms represents white supremacy and fascism. This pattern repeats across issue after issue because both sides have internalized the Cold War's fundamental assumption that political disagreement reflects deeper conflicts between incompatible ways of life. Once you accept this premise, compromise becomes collaboration with evil, moderation becomes cowardice, and the cultivation of doubt about one's own position becomes a luxury that virtuous people cannot afford. The tragedy is that this mindset makes democratic self-governance almost impossible. Democracy depends on the recognition that complex societies contain irreducible diversity and that reasonable people can reach different conclusions about how to balance competing values and interests. But ideological thinking treats this diversity as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be managed through democratic procedures. Chapter 3: The Transformation of Civil Society. One of the most profound insights from my Cold War analysis was understanding how ideological conflict reshapes civil society itself. During the Cold War, institutions that had previously served as spaces for democratic deliberation, universities, professional associations, religious communities, even social clubs, became battlegrounds for competing visions of ultimate truth. The same transformation is occurring in American civil society today, with equally destructive consequences for democratic culture. I remember observing how French universities in the 1960s ceased to function as places of genuine intellectual inquiry and became instead ideological fortresses. Students and faculty were expected to declare their allegiance to particular political programs, and those who insisted on maintaining intellectual independence were marginalized as enemies of progress. The pursuit of truth became subordinated to the advancement of political causes, and the university's traditional role as a space for open debate was sacrificed to its new function as an instrument of social transformation. The parallel development in contemporary American institutions is unmistakable. Universities, which should serve as models of reasoned discourse, have increasingly become places where certain questions cannot be asked and certain arguments cannot be made without triggering accusations of moral turpitude. Professional associations that once focused on advancing their fields now issue political statements and enforce ideological conformity among their members. Even corporate workplaces have been transformed into spaces where employees are expected to affirm particular views about social justice and cultural change. This transformation is particularly damaging because civil society traditionally served as a buffer between individual citizens and political power. When churches, unions, professional organizations, and voluntary associations maintain their independence from partisan politics, they create spaces where people with different political views can cooperate on shared projects and develop relationships that transcend ideological differences. These cross-cutting affiliations are essential for democratic stability because they prevent society from hardening into mutually hostile camps. But when civil society institutions are captured by ideological movements, they lose their mediating function and instead amplify political polarization. Instead of bringing people together across political differences, they sort citizens into competing tribes and reinforce the message that political opponents are not merely wrong but fundamentally different kinds of people who cannot be trusted or respected. The workplace provides a particularly clear example of this dynamic. In previous generations, Americans could generally separate their professional roles from their political commitments. Colleagues with different political views could collaborate effectively on shared professional goals while maintaining their disagreements about broader social questions. This separation wasn't based on indifference to politics, but on the recognition that professional competence and political wisdom are different kinds of excellence that shouldn't be conflated. Today, many workplaces have abandoned this separation and instead demand that employees demonstrate their commitment to particular political principles as a condition of professional acceptance. This development represents the importation of ideological thinking into domains that previously operated according to different logics, and it has the predictable effect of making professional life another arena for political warfare rather than cooperative problem solving. The result is the breakdown of what I called the intermediate structures of democracy, those institutions that stand between the individual and the state and make democratic citizenship possible by providing spaces for civic education and democratic practice. Chapter 4: The Psychology of Permanent Revolution. During my analysis of communist movements, I identified a psychological pattern that I believe explains much about contemporary American political life. Revolutionary ideologies create what I called the psychology of permanent revolution, a mental state in which adherents must constantly discover new enemies and new battles in order to maintain their sense of purpose and moral clarity. This psychology, which I first observed in Stalinist parties, has now migrated into democratic societies and is driving much of our current political dysfunction. The communist intellectual lived in a perpetual state of mobilization. There was always another class enemy to unmask, another deviation to correct, another institution to transform. This wasn't simply a matter of political strategy, it was a psychological necessity. The communists' entire identity was organized around being on the right side of history, and maintaining this identity required the constant discovery of new forms of false consciousness to overcome and new obstacles to revolution to remove. What made this psychology particularly destructive was its inability to recognize success or accept incremental progress. Every achievement had to be simultaneously celebrated as vindication of the revolutionary program and dismissed as insufficient given the magnitude of the remaining task. The psychology of permanent revolution could never acknowledge that its goals had been substantially achieved because doing so would threaten the revolutionary identity that gave life meaning. I see this same psychology at work across the American political spectrum today. Progressive activists who have achieved remarkable success in transforming American attitudes about race, gender, and sexuality cannot acknowledge these achievements without undermining their continued mobilization. Instead, they must constantly identify new forms of oppression and new manifestations of systemic injustice. The extraordinary progress made in reducing discrimination becomes evidence not of success but of how much more sophisticated oppression has become. Conservative activists display the mirror image of this pattern. Having achieved considerable success in building a conservative movement, establishing think tanks and media outlets, and influencing electoral politics, they cannot acknowledge these achievements without undermining their narrative of embattled traditional values. Instead, they must constantly discover new evidence of cultural decline and new threats to American civilization. Both sides are trapped in what I call the paradox of successful movements. The more successful they become, the more they must deny their success in order to maintain the psychological state that motivated their original achievements. This creates a peculiar dynamic where American society simultaneously experiences dramatic social changes and perpetual claims that nothing fundamental has changed. This psychology has profound implications for democratic governance because it makes political satisfaction impossible. Democratic politics works best when citizens can achieve partial victories, consolidate their gains, and then turn their attention to other concerns. But the psychology of permanent revolution makes such satisfaction impossible because it treats partial victory as a form of betrayal and compromise as collaboration with evil. The result is a political culture characterized by escalating demands and diminishing returns. Each victory must be larger than the last, each enemy more dangerous, each battle more consequential. This escalatory dynamic eventually exhausts the capacity for democratic deliberation because it makes everything into a crisis that must be resolved immediately through total victory rather than a problem that can be managed over time through democratic procedures. Chapter 5: The Institutional Consequences. My study of how ideological thinking undermines democratic institutions during the Cold War provides a crucial framework for understanding the current crisis of American institutional legitimacy. When political movements adopt the psychology of permanent revolution, they inevitably come to view existing institutions not as imperfect mechanisms for democratic self-governance that can be improved over time, but as obstacles to justice that must be either captured or destroyed. During the Cold War, I watched communist parties systematically work to undermine democratic institutions while simultaneously claiming to represent democracy in its purest form. They understood that democratic procedures, constitutional constraints, and institutional independence all serve to slow down political change and create space for opposition voices. From a revolutionary perspective, these features weren't bugs in the democratic system. They were fundamental obstacles to the realization of justice that had to be overcome. The same logic is now at work in American politics, though it manifests differently across the political spectrum. Progressive movements increasingly view constitutional constraints like the Electoral College, the Senate structure, and judicial review as illegitimate obstacles to democratic will rather than important safeguards for democratic governance. They interpret institutional resistance to their agenda as evidence that the system itself is corrupt rather than functioning as designed to require broad consensus for major changes. Conservative movements, meanwhile, have increasingly abandoned their traditional reverence for institutional norms and procedures when these institutions fail to produce desired outcomes. The same people who once celebrated judicial restraint now call for court packing when courts rule against them. The same people who once insisted on strict constitutional interpretation now support executive power grabs when their preferred candidate holds office. This institutional nihilism on both sides reflects the importation of revolutionary psychology into democratic politics. When you believe that your political goals represent the demands of justice itself, then institutional obstacles to achieving those goals appear not as legitimate features of democratic governance but as unjust barriers that virtuous people have a duty to overcome by any means necessary. The consequences for democratic culture are severe. Democratic institutions depend not just on formal rules but on informal norms of mutual restraint and good faith engagement. When political actors begin to view these norms as obstacles to justice rather than foundations of legitimate governance, they create a dynamic of institutional degradation that is extremely difficult to reverse. Consider what has happened to the American Senate over the past 2 decades. Both parties have systematically abandoned traditional norms about judicial nominations, legislative procedure, and minority rights. When doing so served their immediate political interests. Each escalation was justified as a necessary response to the other side's previous violations, creating a dynamic where institutional norms erode gradually and then suddenly collapse. The same pattern is visible in other institutions, the presidency, where both parties now support expanded executive power when their candidate wins, the courts, where both sides increasingly view judicial decisions as purely political and illegitimate when they disagree with outcomes, even local institutions like school boards and city councils, which have become battlegrounds for national political movements rather than forums for addressing local concerns. This institutional degradation is particularly dangerous because institutions are what allow democratic societies to manage conflict peacefully over time. When institutions lose their legitimacy, political conflict increasingly moves outside institutional channels and becomes a matter of raw power rather than democratic deliberation. Chapter 6: International Parallels and Lessons. My comparative analysis of how different democratic societies handled ideological pressure during the Cold War reveals important lessons for understanding America's current predicament. Countries that maintained strong democratic institutions and cultures of intellectual independence were better able to resist the polarizing effects of ideological thinking, while those that allowed politics to become totalized experienced the kind of institutional breakdown we're now witnessing in America. Consider the contrast between France and Britain during the height of Cold War tensions. In France, where I lived and worked, intellectual life became dominated by competing ideological orthodoxies. French intellectuals felt compelled to choose sides in every political question, and those who maintained critical distance from both communist and anti-communist dogmas were marginalized as irrelevant or cowardly. This ideological polarization eventually spilled over into electoral politics, contributing to the instability of the Fourth Republic and the eventual crisis that brought de Gaulle to power. Britain, by contrast, maintained a political culture that was more resistant to ideological extremes. While British intellectuals certainly engaged with questions about communism and capitalism, they generally retained a skeptical, empirical approach to political questions that prevented the total polarization that characterized French intellectual life. This cultural difference had institutional consequences. British democracy proved more resilient to the pressures of the Cold War era and maintained higher levels of public trust and institutional legitimacy. The key difference wasn't in the content of British political beliefs, which were often as passionate as those of their French counterparts, but in the intellectual virtues that British political culture continued to value. British intellectuals retained an appreciation for irony, complexity, and intellectual humility that made them resistant to the totalizing certainties that captured so many French minds. These historical lessons are directly relevant to America's current situation because they demonstrate that the cultural and intellectual practices of democratic societies matter as much as their formal institutions. America's founders understood this when they emphasized the importance of civic virtue and democratic education for maintaining republican government. But contemporary American political culture has largely abandoned the intellectual virtues that make democratic deliberation possible. Looking at other contemporary democracies provides additional perspective. Countries like Germany and Canada have experienced their own versions of culture war conflicts, but they have generally managed to prevent these conflicts from completely undermining institutional legitimacy and democratic norms. The key seems to be maintaining what Germans call militant democracy, a commitment to democratic procedures and constitutional values that transcends particular political outcomes. Scandinavian countries offer another instructive model. Despite significant political disagreements about economic policy, immigration, and social change, these societies have maintained relatively high levels of social trust and institutional legitimacy. Part of this success reflects cultural factors that cannot easily be replicated elsewhere, but part of it reflects conscious efforts to maintain democratic norms and prevent political disagreements from becoming existential conflicts. The lesson for America is not that we should copy other countries' institutional arrangements, but that we should recognize that democratic culture is something that must be actively cultivated and defended. The intellectual virtues that make democratic citizenship possible, the ability to engage in good faith with opposing viewpoints, the willingness to acknowledge complexity and uncertainty, the capacity to distinguish between political opponents and enemies, don't maintain themselves automatically but require constant cultivation through education, media, and civic institutions. Chapter 7: Cultivating Democratic Wisdom. The path forward from our current crisis requires what I call the cultivation of democratic wisdom, a set of intellectual and moral virtues that enable citizens to participate in democratic governance without falling into the traps of ideological thinking. This wisdom cannot be achieved through political means alone but requires a broader cultural transformation that begins with individual citizens and spreads through civil society institutions. Democratic wisdom begins with intellectual humility, the recognition that political questions are genuinely complex and that reasonable people can reach different conclusions about how to balance competing values and interests. This doesn't mean abandoning strong convictions or retreating into relativism, but rather holding our convictions in a way that remains open to evidence, criticism, and the possibility that we might be partially wrong about important questions. During my years observing ideological movements, I noticed that their adherents consistently displayed what I call epistemic arrogance, the belief that they had achieved a kind of political knowledge that made further inquiry unnecessary. Communist intellectuals were convinced that historical materialism had revealed the laws of social development. Anti-communist crusaders were equally convinced that they understood the essential nature of the communist threat. Both sides treated complexity and uncertainty as obstacles to clear thinking rather than fundamental features of political reality. Democratic wisdom requires the opposite disposition, a willingness to live with uncertainty and complexity while still making the practical decisions that democratic governance requires. This means learning to distinguish between questions that admit of clear answers and those that require ongoing negotiation and adjustment. It means developing comfort with partial solutions and incremental progress rather than demanding total victories and final answers. The cultivation of this wisdom requires what I call democratic education, not political indoctrination in favor of particular outcomes, but training in the intellectual skills and moral dispositions that make democratic citizenship possible. Citizens need to learn how to evaluate evidence, how to engage constructively with opposing viewpoints, how to recognize and resist propaganda and manipulation, and how to participate in democratic deliberation without losing their capacity for independent judgment. This education cannot be confined to formal schooling but must extend throughout civil society. Professional associations, religious communities, voluntary organizations, and even workplaces need to become spaces where people practice the arts of democratic citizenship, listening carefully to different perspectives, finding common ground while acknowledging disagreement, and working together on shared projects despite political differences. Media institutions have a particularly important role to play in this cultural transformation. Instead of treating politics as entertainment or tribal warfare, media outlets could model the kind of serious, nuanced engagement with complex issues that democratic governance requires. This means resisting the temptation to reduce every story to a simple narrative of conflict between good and evil, and instead helping citizens understand the genuine complexities and trade-offs involved in political decisions. Political leaders also bear responsibility for modeling democratic wisdom rather than exploiting polarization for short-term advantage. This means being willing to acknowledge the legitimate concerns of political opponents, to admit uncertainty about complex issues, and to prioritize the long-term health of democratic institutions over immediate political gains. Most importantly, individual citizens must take responsibility for their own intellectual development and democratic participation. This means actively seeking out information that challenges our preconceptions, engaging respectfully with people who hold different political views, and resisting the temptation to retreat into ideological echo chambers that confirm our existing beliefs while demonizing our opponents. The goal is not to eliminate political disagreement or to achieve some impossible consensus on controversial issues, but to restore the cultural conditions that make democratic disagreement productive rather than destructive. Conclusion. The Cold War taught us that ideological thinking is democracy's greatest internal threat, not because it promotes strong convictions, but because it destroys the intellectual virtues that make democratic coexistence possible. Today's culture wars represent the domestic flowering of seeds planted during that earlier conflict, and they will continue to intensify until we consciously choose to cultivate different habits of mind and heart. The solution is not political but cultural, the patient work of rebuilding the intellectual foundations that make democratic citizenship possible. This requires each of us to examine our own susceptibility to ideological thinking and to practice the difficult arts of intellectual humility, constructive skepticism, and good faith engagement with those who disagree with us. It means choosing the harder path of democratic wisdom over the easier satisfactions of ideological certainty. Democracy's survival depends not on the triumph of any particular political program, but on our collective ability to maintain the cultural conditions that allow free peoples to govern themselves through reasoned deliberation rather than ideological warfare. This is the lesson of the Cold War, and it remains the central challenge of our time. The choice between democratic wisdom and ideological thinking is not a political choice but a moral one, and it is a choice that each generation must make anew.